как Никольская, новая талажанка. Пострадали 3 мирных жителя. 16 ноября от атак беспилотников по коммерческому объекту и территории предприятия в поселке Борисовка и Коваля нового
of a geriatric center and an orphanage. DPR on the 14th of November, we learned about an atrocious tragedy in Alexander Kalinovko. Ukrainian fighters had a cynical hunt over the rector of the local church of the Royal Martyrs. His family and parishioners tried to evacuate from the hostilities area. Ukrainian Nazists for a long time used drones and mortars to kill unarmed people, injuring them time and again. As a result, 7 people, including the clergy, died, but it was not enough for the Bandera sadists. For a long time, they didn't let other villagers to take the bodies and to bury them, and they halted these attempts using drones. This is the kind of a bloodshed safari of Ukrainian Bandera supporters against civilians. What we saw confirms the hatred of the Zelensky regime. The Kiev regime seeks to exterminate everything in the DPR. It is proven by the account of a civilian, namely in Yatskovka. She said to media outlets, there was a case when Bandera supporter shot her, but he missed, fortunately, when she said hello to the fighters in Russian, and that's why she was the target. The monster's bullet just whizzed right by her head. The Kherson region. On the 14th of November, Ukrainian attacks in Novovladimivka and Chelykovka wounded 2 persons. On the 17th of November, drones attacked a civilian. On the 18th of November, a mine dropped from a drone, killing a man. And they pay a price for all that. The Russian courts continue to pass sentences to Ukrainian fighters and mercenaries for the crimes in the Kursk region against civilians and Russian servicemen. Lengthy prison terms were given to captive fighters of Ukraine. Roman Petrovsky, Ivan Sharutin, 14 years in prison were given to mercenaries from Colombia and Japan. Manjaboy Pinto Nelson, Esteban and Takao Toyonaka, they are on an international wanted list. What preceded that? It wasn't just a pretext, it was the foundation on which Ukrainians, West Anglo-Saxons built this atrocious, bloody massacre. Tomorrow, on the 21st of November, will mark the 12 years since the tragic developments of the so-called Euromaidan in the center of Kiev that led Ukraine to a disaster. Indeed, luckily, this preface to this atrocious tragedy, back in the day, it was called a Euromaidan, although they tried to put a different meaning to that. Today, we understand the genuine sense. It was another color revolution carried out by the West in order to oust the legitimate authorities. Skilled instigators trained by foreign instructors under lucrative motives that are trivial and stupid, that are designed for people that do not think, that only perceive memes, regarding the European life, democracy, freedom of speech, human rights, and fighting against corruption, they took crowds to the street not to participate in peaceful rallies. They played the role of the driving force that turned into bloodshed and putsch. It was refuted and rejected by citizens of other regions of Ukraine. At the same time, this Euromaidan marched through Kiev. And today it would be appropriate to ask a question: what exactly Euromaidan gave to Ukraine and to its people? Did their dream of European integration came true? The answer is clear. It used to be a self-sufficient industrial and densely populated republic of the former Soviet Union. Now it has turned into an impoverished, extinct territory. It has lost its independence. It is funded by Western colonizers, which define its domestic and foreign policy. And let me call spade a spade. They embezzle money using Ukraine, but after this money laundering, money turned bloody red. It became normal for Ukraine to have large-scale human rights violations, to have discrimination of its citizens on ethnic and linguistic grounds. There is the rampage of corruption, and lawlessness is triumphant. At full swing is the totalitarian repressive machine to oppose dissent, and hardly Ukrainians that took to the streets on the so-called Maidan in November 2013 could imagine the tragic consequences. They paid a high price for their European choice, as they believed back in the day. You know what's the trick? Ukraine has always been part of Europe. It's a part of the continent. It's the European part of the Eurasian space. In literature, in culture, it has always been Europe in its traditions. But they were told, no, you have never been a part of Europe, but you can successfully invest and become a part of Europe. That's what they done. They have invested a great deal of human lives. Moving on to the current developments, and let us call a spade a spade. These are the repercussions of Euromaidan. It's not about a corruption scandal, corruption case, not at all. These are repercussions of the destroyed statehood of Ukraine through external governance, uncontrolled flow of money and weapons, and lack of any accountability under any modalities. New atrocious details of this scandal are becoming public, but actually we're talking about outright mafia clique, atrocious murderous shenanigans. Due to many leaks, embezzlers on the Bankover Street use quite sophisticated models of seizing funds of their allies. There is a great deal of materials that were made public, and they give food for thought. We're talking about huge money laundering by purchasing Western-sponsored drones at the exorbitant prices. The majority of these drones are destroyed by Russian air defense, and pocketing the money of sponsors that are sent to rebuild the damaged energy infrastructure, but actually they end up in private accounts. The funding for weapons and energy flow into the same hands. Now Zelensky and his partners in crime try to make excuses. Traditionally, surprising as it may seem, they blame everything on the Kremlin. That's the one who is to blame. However, rank-and-file Ukrainians do not buy it. And we wanted it to happen much earlier, but it's best to have it now than never. According to the opinion polls, 73 respondents believe that the corruption has increased significantly over the past 4 years. We're talking about 4 years of war. And a quarter of respondents believe that Verkhovna Rada and Zelensky is to blame. 62% support the resignation of Yermak from his post. And given the current developments, these figures could be even much more negative for the Kiev regime. According to Ukrainian sources, the so-called N18G case made Zelensky ratings drop and plummet. Currently, this rating stands at no more than 20%, and I believe this is the kind of indicator where Zelensky could even be much more successful, so to speak, than his friends in Europe, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz. They set these anti-records. The Western Party of War, as if nothing happened, continue reckless military and financial funneling of the Kiev regime. On the 13th of November, NATO published a decision of Scandinavian and Baltic countries to allocate $500 million to procure American weaponry. Within this initiative, and I name it the prioritized Ukraine requirements list. According to this list, these are no medications or humanitarian assistance, not at all, no education, economic growth, or any kind of development, not at all. We're talking about something that can kill as many Ukrainians as possible, kill them ultimately. That is something NATO gives money for. On the 14th of November, Defense Minister of Germany, Boris Pistorius, announced Berlin's intention to dip into its pocket once again and to add some 150 million euros. Clearly, the fear of Western establishment to recognize that their project has failed and completely lose trust of the deceived taxpayers prevails over common sense. On the 14th of November, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, the post occupied by Kaja Kallas, in her statement at the press conference of defense ministers of Germany, the UK, Poland, Italy, and France in Berlin, thanked Germany for its decision to increase the annual support to Kiev to 11.5 billion euros. Reportedly, this saves lives of Ukrainians and sets an example for the rest of Europe. What kind of an example does it set? I dare ask. Kaja Kallas hypocritically accused Russia of not wishing to have negotiations. Just the other day, first, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine stated that they withdrew from any negotiating processes with Russia, and immediately, Kaja Kallas claims that Russia allegedly abandoned negotiations. When? When was it made exactly? What was the date of this decision? She called to increased funding for Ukraine in 2026, including at the expense of frozen Russian assets. And without even blinking, she called assistance to Ukraine a good deal compared to the price of victory of Russia. That is something atrocious. Only a monster can think in these terms. I've always believed, frankly speaking, that a woman in politics, especially since she has kids, understands the price of her words. She can project everything she says to her experience of being a mother. She can use these logic and she can put it into practice to project it to the life of her family and kids. And Kaja Kallas is a woman, and she said that that is a good deal compared to the price of Russian victory. Why is it a good deal? Is it a good deal in terms of the number of Ukrainians killed And another surreal statement was made by another Russophobe, Andrius Kubilius, on the 17th of November at the Conference on Defense in Lithuania. He said that it is necessary to establish peace with the Ukrainian army that has combat experience and to deploy them in Lithuania together with German brigade and rotating American troops.
He said that Ukrainian Nazis are to become, quotation, a guarantee of security before the threat of a Russian attack on Europe, end of quote. How do they imagine that? After peace, how will that happen? Because peace would mean that the sides take obligations not to carry out any hostilities. So after the sides agree on that, the Ukrainian army will relocate to another side of the European continent. And then you will just need to burn the torch. Because the most rabid Euro vouchers, Zelensky signed an agreement with Macron for 10 years that includes the purchase of 100 Rafale multi-combat aircraft and 8 SMPT air defense systems. Zelensky qualified this document as historical. Maybe some aspect he is right, because this document will remain in history. It's not even a deal, it's a declaration of intention. Because it's about 20 billion euro purchase, and the Kiev regime does not have the money for such a large purchase. And Paris does not have the equipment mentioned in this agreement. So one side does not have the money, the other side does not have the goods, but they have agreed on something for the future. So one of the largest scams in modern history is looming. Even when it is shipped, even if someday it is delivered, it will be a threat for our security. So on the 18th of November, Zelensky visited Spain, and Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced a new military aid package for Kiev, totaling 615 million euros, almost a half of which will go towards the supply of air defense missiles and other defense equipment. Madrid also pledged to ensure security in Europe and strengthen defense industry and supporting Ukrainian military equipment manufacturers. So it has a hidden agenda. It's no secret that Zelensky sponsors are demanding increased mobilization, primarily by lowering the draft age. The Europeans, in replenishing the Ukrainian armed forces' losses, they are primarily concerned about preventing a new influx of refugees from Ukraine. In order to relieve themselves from the burden of those who were fortunate enough to leave Ukraine, of those people. So it's about tightening the conditions of obtaining asylum. They just spent time there on the territory of European countries. They were fed there like a pig, and then to slaughter them. It's just monstrous. They need them not like refugees, not even like their own citizens, not people who are temporarily on the territory of a foreign state, only as expendable material, as an instrument for implementing their own tasks. Now let us see what is happening in the Ukrainian armed forces. It's about demoralization and disillusionment. The Aftenposten media has published a report from this town of Izum, where an Azov fighter from the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces described the demotivating effect of the mass exodus of 18 to 22-year-old Ukrainians abroad. The exodus of soldiers. So he called on Norway and other European countries to return those people home, if not to send them to the battlefield, at least to work and live. Otherwise, who and what would they fight for? So that's the question to the one interviewed. Just the citizens of Ukraine ask this question of who and what do you fight for? For Zelensky to become richer and to launder that money for those who is supplying them for him from the West. Of course, in order to use Ukraine as an instrument to counter Russia, yes, certainly, but primarily, if we have a look at the Ukrainian territory, all this story, it has only one purpose. The purpose of getting richer for those who are an instrument in the hands of the West. An instrument to get back all those tranches, an instrument for geopolitical games. There are no other reasons. That's what the people are sent by those officials on Bankovo, sent to participate in meat storms. So does the person who was interviewed has a soul? I cannot tell you that. But in the official statistics, the rate of desertion from the Ukrainian armed forces has increased almost 44-fold, from 3,687 people in 2022 to 161,461 people in 2025. It's an indicator of the growth of desertion from the Ukrainian armed forces. That's how the Ukrainian citizens are running from the front line. On the 15th of November, in an interview with the Ukrainian television NTA, Roman Kostenko, a member of the Verkhovna Rada Defense Committee, noted that given the acute shortage of people in the Ukrainian armed forces, both psychologically and morally, quotation, there will soon be another army of voluntary deserters that will have to be reckoned with, end of quote. According to him, approximately 26,500 Ukrainians mobilized monthly. Just think about it. Of 26,500 Ukrainians, more than 21,000 become deserters. I would remind you, this person is a member of the Verkhovna Rada Defense Committee. So that's the data provided by the person who is aware of what he is talking about. He has the facts. Currently, the Verkhovna Rada discusses legislative amendments to further tighten forced mobilization, abolishing free travel for young people abroad or lowering the recruitment age to 23 or even to 18 years, and revising the reservation conditions. Their possible adoption would only exacerbate the situation and increase the outflow of Ukrainians who have so far escaped the fate of cannon fodder. These facts confirm the urgency of the tasks of denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine and the elimination of threats coming from its territory. All these goals will certainly be achieved, as it has been repeatedly stated by Russian officials. And regarding the resolution draft, the draft of the resolution about human rights in the temporarily occupied territories, as they call it, of Ukraine, including the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. It's the unjustified, unfounded claims by the Kiev regime. It's actually torn from the reality, and 14 countries were in solidarity with us on this document. So its document sponsors once again failed to achieve the consensus approval of this document. And over 90 states rejected this draft resolution. This long text is in the worst traditions of the public rhetoric and political inventions by the Kiev regime. They failed to propose anything new in essence, and it's just accusing our country, accusing Russia. Let us have a look at the examples, blatant examples of unprecedented cynicism and lack of principles. Are the formed concerns, so-called concerns about alleged systematic violations. It's just ridiculous. By Russian authorities of the rights of ethnic and religious minorities, primarily the Crimean Tatars. Has anyone just talked to them? Has anyone talked to them at all? Someone among those who has launched this text of the resolution. It's just a false idea included into the document, quotation to provide conditions for education in Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar languages and to stop the blocking of access to Ukrainian education that is qualified as systematic racial discrimination. Just pay attention to that. The initiators of the adopted resolution, they just do not see any problems in the targeted repressive policy of derussification of their own countries carried out by the Kiev regime. The creation of a mono-ethnic Ukrainian state that has no place for Russians. It's just according to the mood of the Ukrainian president. It's violation of human rights. This policy since 2018 on elimination of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, its persecutions, harassment, killings we have mentioned today. Also violence against believers, parishioners, physical violence, up to murders of clergy members, seizure of church property, desecration of holy places. It's the decision of the International Court of Justice of the United Nations of January 21st, 2024 on the implementation of the provisions of the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism and the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. And the call to implement the decision of the International Court of Justice ruling of the 16th of March 2022. So it's just absurd actions by the Ukrainian officials. And the Zelensky regime is just projecting the situation in his own country to our country. It has been violation of the freedom of speech, clearing the political landscape from competitors, intimidation of journalists, human rights activists, bloggers. Just do you remember one of the people, one person participating in negotiations, he came back to Ukraine and he was shot. So it just happened. It was an unclear situation. There are cases of kidnapping, violent disappearance, and torture against Russian prisoners of war. It's mass human rights violations. It's inhuman Kiev dictatorship. This rapidly degrading situation with the protection of human rights in Ukraine has become largely possible due to connivance and tacit approval of Western countries. It's just violence and lawlessness. And the Russian Federation is committed to its international human rights obligations, including on the territory of Crimea, Sevastopol, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. It's the Russian legislation in force that guarantees all citizens their rights, the rights to labor, healthcare, and others. And international treaties of the Russian Federation are in place there. The residents enjoy all the human rights and freedoms without discriminations in comparison with the residents of other regions of Russia. Regarding languages, it's actually the first time, if we're talking about the new and the modern history, such a package for studying languages, for using languages, for creating media outlets in their own languages. Crimean residents have received those rights with the guarantees by Russia, legally enshrined and actively implemented in practice. This week, at the invitation of the Assembly of the Peoples of the World and the Civic Chamber of Russia, Chilean writer and journalist visited our country. Patricio Maribel, he told about his trip to Donbass. He spoke to human rights activists. He brought humanitarian aid to the Ambrosievka orphanage. He also brought a rose from the Donetsk People's Republic. Actually, those roses, many people have them now. Those roses are made from shrapnel, from shells used by the Ukrainian forces to bomb hospitals, schools, and kindergartens in Donetsk. His book explores the fate of the Russian-speaking population in this military conflict. He is telling about the fate of children. It's an attempt to show, to demonstrate the human dimension of the conflict, if we use the international term. But if we talk in simple words, the grief, the suffering of people. And a separate chapter the author has devoted to the crimes of the extremist Ukrainian Azov battalion banned in Russia. The Chilean writer also took part in a number of round-table discussions, and he reiterated his commitment to tell the truth on the international platform and to counter those lies broadcast by European and American media outlets. We are grateful to Patricio Maribel for his honest reporting, despite all attempts by the West to silence it and to distort it.
We continue to follow the developments in Moldova. The authorities of this country use the pretext of Euromaidan, the so-called Euro integration project. They keep the policy to sever ties with Russia and with its people, and it was manifested once again when Moldovan parliament adopted on the 13th of November in the first reading the bill denouncing Russia-Moldova intergovernmental agreement on the establishment of cultural centers. We're talking about the Russian Science and Culture Center in Chisinau, also known as the Russian House. What is the pretext? Russia might use this agreement, and I quote, as a tool to advance the distorted narratives. They use this terminology. At the same time, Moldovan deputies recognize that the systemic monitoring of the Russian House has not taken place. They made this decision under the highly likely principle. During the session of the parliament, members of the ruling party, the Sandu regime's party, went as far as, I do not know how to say it. They accused our prominent poet Alexander Pushkin in imposing non-traditional relations in Bessarabia. He came to Bessarabia in the 19th century, and that's how it all started. It's not just Russophobia, it is a mania, schizophrenia, and such statements confirm the general rule. Russophobia and refusal from the Russian culture lead to the loss of common sense and to the health problems, because that is gibberish that is said in the parliament of the country. Moldovans, the citizens of Moldova, made their choice so that these people could champion the interests of citizens of this country, so that they could address urgent matters, so that they would develop laws to benefit their country. No, Pushkin is to blame for everything. That's just funny. There was a episode of our comic show regarding Pushkin, who is to blame for everything, and we used to think that it was a joke, but it was not a joke. It was a scenario for the future of many countries. Meanwhile, the officials in Chisinau continued to cleanse the political landscape of the country from unloyal forces, and the pinnacle was the kangaroo court over the head of Gagauzia, Yevgenia Gutsu. It is politicized and it seeks to intimidate the dissent. Probably they will have legal proceedings against Pushkin as well. The integration of the country into Euro-Atlantic entities are in full swing. That's what they are covering with their gibberish. They cannot recognize to their own people that they sacrifice people, the citizens of Moldova, in order to have these handouts, grants, and to ensure the future of only part of the society, the political establishment. As for the rest, they will all be sacrificed. From the 26th of October to 13th of November, Moldova hosted military exercises, Peace Shield 2025, in order to assess skills of the national army in line with the NATO operational capabilities concept before their possible participation in international peacekeeping missions. What kind of an international peacekeeping mission are we talking about? The question begs itself. The citizens of Moldova ask Sandu, what kind of peacekeeping missions can NATO put on its track record? What kind of peacekeeping missions of NATO are we talking about? In Libya, for instance, there were peacekeeping efforts by NATO, which split the country apart, let alone huge losses massacre and the tragedy that the Libyan people suffers from, let alone the repercussions for Western and Southern Europe. Thousands of Libyan refugees fled from their country via the Mediterranean to Europe. Maybe we can remember another success story for NATO and its peacekeeping missions. Maybe we're talking about the bombing of Yugoslavia that became the beacon of hope. And Sandu guides its own people to follow this example. Although Sandu has a different kind of people, Romanians, Iraq, Afghanistan, we shouldn't even begin this story. NATO has no peacekeeping missions whatsoever that could lead to peacekeeping results. They're only destructive missions of NATO. On the 11th of November, the Defense Ministry of Moldova announced it received another batch of transport vehicles from the European Peace Facility. Moldova is the second recipient of assistance through the so-called pacifist fund after Ukraine. Last year, EU former permanent representative bragged that the support for armed forces of Moldova by EU since 2021 reached 137 million euros. It is all happening amid the economic collapse and the collapse of social sector. Over the 5 years of the ruling party, the Moldovan inflation grew by 66%. The GDP had 0% growth, including its financial assistance. The industry has dropped by 4.2%. Agriculture has decreased by 13.5%. Probably Alexander Pushkin is also to blame for that. He once came to Bessarabia. The helplessness and incompetence of the Chisinau regime became obvious for the Western sponsors, and the red flag was the decision by the IMF to block the latest tranche, 170 million USD, due to non-compliance with fiscal policy and governance. As a result, the authorities had to take loans from France, since it has apparently no problems. Everything is so secured in France that they even steal from the Louvre at daylight. And clearly, this is a failed policy of the budget policy. We regret to state that under the current leadership, Moldova is turning into the territory of poverty and lawlessness, and the people see that and they vote with their foot by immigrating in more promising countries, including Russia. There were a lot of questions that we have already commented upon. Let me repeat it once again. On the 19th of November, the Foreign Ministry of Poland announced us that the Consul General of Russia in Gdansk shall stop its operation. Previously, in November 2024 and June 2025, Russian Consulate General in Poznan and Krakow ceased to operate, and we believe that it is a hostile step that seeks to destabilize and destroy bilateral relations amid the caveman Russophobia in Poland. Certainly the Russian side will respond appropriately, and we will limit the Polish consular diplomatic presence in Russia. Cambodia, Thailand situation. We express concern over the recent exacerbation of the border conflict between the two countries. Hopefully, as a result of a dialogue, bilaterally, the countries would resume the implementation of the joint declaration that was signed on the 26th of October in Kuala Lumpur. must stand for addressing all disputes solely by peaceful means. Such territorial disputes are the result of the colonial policy of the West. Amid severe degradation in security in the Asia-Pacific, it is especially important to act within the spirit of unity and solidarity for ASEAN to overcome historical differences. Djibouti. I can say that there have been Russian Days of Culture as part of the state program to advance the Russian language abroad of the Culture Ministry of Russia, Roskoncert, Roskino, with the support of the Russian Embassy in Djibouti. We held a number of events that seek to familiarize the foreign audience with Russian cultural legacy. These Russian Culture Days took place from the 15th to 17th of November. In the People's Palace of Djibouti, there were artists of the Moscow People's Choir, as well as workshops on the Russian language. The events were attended by the Prime Minister, Minister for Youth and Culture, Higher Education Minister, representatives of political circles, media, diplomatic corps, and our compatriots. And the significant part of the audience were Djibouti's school children and students. The invited officials and guests praised the high artistic professionalism of Russian artists, and these events were broadly covered in the media outlets. The successful Russian Culture Days once again confirmed the importance of this format on the African continent and our commitment to develop bilateral cooperation in culture and education. Starting with mid-September, Mali has been experiencing fuel crisis due to systemic attacks by fighters of pro-Al-Qaeda JNAIM group. We're talking about attacks on car convoys that provide fuel to the capital. We're talking about supplies from Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. The jihadists spread fake news in order to sow mass discontent among common citizens and to mount pressure on the transitional government in Mali. Currently, the African Corps of the Russian MOD has been actively working on the ground. We have organized the checkpoints at the routes of the convoys. The fighters of terrorist groups suffer severe losses. Lately, there's been a decrease in this fuel crisis in Mali. Russia intends to further provide assistance to the friendly people of Mali when it comes to overcoming their hurdles so that they would ensure their independent, sustainable development. A lot has been said about that. But actually, our country pays special attention to that. You know, on the 20th of November, we mark the 18 years since the start of the work of the international military trials in Nuremberg. It is an unparalleled judicial process that condemned the main military criminals of the Third Reich. The rulings of the trial made a significant contribution formalizing legally the outcome of World War II. It recognized as a crime the hate ideology and the Nazi practice, and this ruling cannot be appealed neither from legal or from political standpoint. The role of Nuremberg cannot be overestimated. The trial, its charter, and the ruling became the stepping point to shape the norms of the international criminal law. Our country was at the origins of the trial. The Soviet Union was the first to shape the concept of the international process against Nazi criminals, and from day one of the war, it shaped standards for a just proceedings. It is universally recognized that the crimes of Nazi do not have the expiry date, and unfortunately, for several years, we have been witnessing unscrupulous attempts to rewrite history, to put into oblivion the lessons of Nuremberg, to mar the actions of the USSR and the Red Army. And Europe is breeding neo-Nazi movements sweepingly. Building upon this framework, there were countries that were liberated by the Red Army from this complete inhumane destruction by fascists and Nazis. Previously, there were monuments to honor heroes, and currently they demolished these monuments, and these memorials are replaced by monuments to honor representatives of ideology of racial supremacy. There are former SS members' marches, and the most radical forms take place in Ukraine and in the Baltic states. As you might know, the Russian Foreign Ministry repeatedly calls not to forget the lessons of the past. You should realize that rewriting history and the complicity to neo-Nazis inevitably can lead to mounting threat of repeating the greatest strategy of the 20th century. To mark the 80th anniversary of the trial, exhibition hall Manege is hosting the International Forum Nuremberg 80 years. Foreign Minister Lavrov sent a video address. Tomorrow, the 21st of November, there will be a sectoral session within this forum. It is dedicated to the international legal and diplomatic dimension of the Nuremberg trials, the role in shaping of post-war world order, the importance of preserving historical truth and confronting attempts to falsify history. That is the reason why I postponed the briefing, because I've just come from the Manege exhibition hall and I participated in the session on the media coverage of the Nuremberg trials. We're talking about this huge exhibition in the Manege hall. Can you believe it? We have recreated the hall where the Nuremberg trial took place, with the flags of the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition that served justice on behalf of the people of the world. And there were benches where criminals were sitting. There were places for secretaries, for those who took notes. And there are live stories and witness accounts of those who spent a lot of days and years studying this case. Scientists, academics came, as well as children of those who participated in the trials, who covered the work of the Nuremberg trials. I have no doubt that the materials of these 2 days of the conference will be part of an interactive exhibition on the internet, and that they would be accessible to the broadest audience. That is something truly grand, and it is decent for the memory of those who served justice over Nazism and fascism on behalf of the people and countries. Today, on the 20th of November, the BRICS Municipalities Forum takes place. Over the past years, the forum has gained credibility. The platform is an efficient tool to strengthen partnership in implementing joint projects at the regional and municipal levels. The event was praised by the BRICS Summit Declaration in 2020 and in 2024. According to organizers, this year the forum will bring together 5,000 participants from 76 countries, including 700 speakers, including heads of cities, experts, and business communities. The program includes 10 sections. Namely, participants will discuss the artificial intelligence, digital transformation, neural networks, industrial technologies of the future, science, education, logistics, cultural exchange, tourism. They will focus on investment projects presentation. The discussions will focus on improving living standards, providing sustainable cities development, as well as building humanitarian contacts.
The outcome of this event will be practical decisions aimed at new partnership, concluding commercial deals, strengthening the existing connections that make the BRICS countries, cities, the centers of growth and balanced development. one more event that has been carried out. I would like to highlight that in the city of Vangsai, there was a ceremony of anti-mine center of the Russian Federation. Another stage of works of unexploded munitions that have remained from the time of the aggression of the United States in Indochina. It's the 1960s, 1970s. From 1964 to 1973, U.S. aircraft carried out actually 500,000 of combat sorties over Laos territory, dropping 3 million tons of bombs and cluster munitions. Around 30% of those mines remained unexploded. They continued to pose a serious threat to local residents and hinder the normalization of economic activities in the affected areas. In total, since 2018, Russian and Lao specialists have demined more than 208 hectares. Russian specialists have assisted in training of 164 Lao People's Army engineering specialists. It plays an important part in demining and going back to normal life. It's an important role of Russian specialists who pass the experience to Lao colleagues. We will continue to carry out this humanitarian mission and continue to form the conditions of development of friendly Laos with whom we enjoy the relations of a strategic partnership. Now it's about the concert, the successful concert of Moscow Synodal Choir in Italy. The organizer of this event was the Foundation for the Support of Sacred Music and Art that is closely affiliated with the Vatican. Also, the concert was carried out with the support of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Culture, as concert, and the Moscow Patriarchate. The honorary president of this fund, Maria Zakharova, was present, as well as ambassadors and diplomats from Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Serbia, Hungary, some countries of Latin America and Africa, and priests from Russian Orthodox Church and journalists. I would like to highlight the professionalism of this choir. And we actually welcome its return to Rome. It's the confirmation of the enduring significance of Russian cultural heritage. The recent event has become extraordinary. It vividly demonstrated the futility of those attempts, as they say, to cancel Russian culture and to sever the close spiritual ties that exist between the Vatican, Italy, and Russia. And we are especially grateful to the festival organizers for this fruitful collaboration. And I'm ready to answer your questions. Is международная жизнь, international life, with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. Hello. How would you comment on the publications about the Foreign Ministry of Montenegro declaring Russian ambassador Alexander Lukashek, accusing him of interference in the domestic affairs of the country? So unfortunately, it's just another case of some sick reaction So just any statement by a Russian diplomat, it causes such reaction, similar reaction. There are just two ways. One way is just not to provide some comments, not to publish interviews. And the second one is to start hysteria after some comments have been issued. It's just narratives that are destructive for Western Europeans, for Anglo-Saxons. Their heads just filled with some rubbish. It's just their input into the Russophobic campaign. They're distorting facts, they're hiding them, they deprive their own public of legal access to objective information, to alternative assessment. Like in an interview by Sergei Lavrov to Corriere della Sera media outlet, when he provided the talking points very important for the Italian public. In a distorted way, they are provided to the Italians by the top officials of this country. He just accompanied these facts with a special comment that he thinks that they will be useful for the Italian public in order to understand this situation. And this part was cut from the interview as well. Russian representatives are the source that the Westerners would like just to ban, to stop. This approach is not right. It's dangerous for themselves. To live in such a simulator in the world of fakes and post-truth, it's dangerous for those who are inside primarily. And those actions against diplomats are contrary to international practice, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and this contrary to the corresponding, the relevant conventions, the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. Diplomats should just make public to the wide audience the position of his country without any offenses, without any violation of the legislation of his co-host country and so on, but to convey this information about the steps of his own country, especially international affairs and bilateral affairs. If someone does not agree, they should counter within the framework of discussion with arguments and not just tearing this interview from publications, from newspapers, deleting it from the internet, inventing some fairy tales that there is no place on the service, and offense against the speaker. Thank you. One more question, if you allow me. Recently in Armenia, but you know why they are doing that. We also face interviews published in the Russian information segment, Russian speaking or having a Russian license. We have interviews of foreign activists, politicians, diplomats, ambassadors, to whom we have questions, questions by the public, by governmental authorities, ministries. We just publish arguments against them, or we address the editor, as it is done in civilized states. And those who have just taught us the freedom of speech, they just do not publish it. They just take some illegal measures. And thank you very much. Another question. Recently, Armenian authorities denied entry to Russian war correspondent Dmitry Seleznov, who was covering the conflict in Karabakh. They did it without explanation. How can you comment on this? So they used to make statements about pluralism, transparency, and so on, and just let us see the result. Dmitry Seleznov was denied entry to Armenia. So whether the journalist is accused of any crimes on the territory of the Republic, and we have not received information how this ban can be lifted. But it's well known that in 2022, Dmitry Seleznov reported on Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Our embassy in Yerevan requested information about the reasons for such a decision. And we hope it is not connected with the journalist activities of Dmitry Seleznov, because that was not correlate with the image of Armenia as a democratic state. And the freedom of speech is just the freedom of the press. It's just characteristics of any true democracy. So is Anadolu with us? So I would ask once again, is Anadolu with us? Yes, yes, please. So we have a question about Kiev declaring the renewal of the process of prisoners of war exchange with the mediatorship of Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. Is it possible? Does it mean that the direct negotiations process is becoming an indirect process? And does it mean there will be no direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in the near future? So I would answer no, because it does not mean that at all. And we have had direct negotiations. Russia has had direct negotiations. There was an exchange of the detained prisoners of war with the goodwill of mediators, and there were both cases. You can have a look at our website. We usually thanked those countries. If that was verified with them, it was agreed upon with them. Those countries who have acted as mediators these years. Please do not make such incorrect conclusions. And I would like to highlight that all contexts of prisoners of war exchange, it was within the scope of the relevant profile structures. And our diplomats accompanied them, provided diplomatic assistance, but the main role was played by the relevant structures. And if any agreements are reached, we will provide diplomatic assistance to the exchange process, and we will inform you on that. And another question, if you allow me. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visited the territories of Syria occupied by the Israeli troops. So my question is, how does Moscow assess this visit from the point of view of Syrian sovereignty? Actually, I will have a look at this piece of news, and I will request the comment of our experts, because I cannot comment right now. I have not seen those reports, and I will come back to you with our comments. Thank you. Thank you. Is Ria Novosti with us? Yes. Hello, Madam Zakharova. Christina Rodriguez, Ria Novosti. We have two questions today. First of all, I would like you to comment a number of interviews published both in Azerbaijani and Armenian media in connection with the 5th anniversary of the end of the Second Karabakh War, including Russia's role in the events of that time. What can you say about those interviews? Actually, we have also published something on that. On the 7th of November, there was a statement published on our ministry website on the 5th anniversary of signing the ceasefire agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Our position is open. It is consistent. We actually comment this issue during our briefings. We have commented on that many times during our briefings. And I would remind you that thanks to the personal efforts by our President Vladimir Putin, we have restored, we have stopped the bloodshed in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 and 2023. Those agreements are still relevant, and they form a roadmap between Baku and Yerevan. And we are ready to cooperate with our partners to assist them in finding the mutually acceptable solutions. Second question, destructive policy of the West in the South Caucasus, particularly it's about Georgia and Armenia. Moldova and Ukraine are held up by the EU as role models for accession as candidate for EU membership. How would you comment on that? So Ukraine and Moldova can be held up as examples only to those who you hate. It's only possible in that case if they hate them. But that's a fact, actually. Just have a look what they are doing with Georgia under hypocritical pretexts. It's about alleged protection of democracy. They are trying to engage them in their political games. Is that consistent desire? So threats have just become commonplace in the region. It's about sanctions and blackmail of the total people. So Georgians have their arms twisted in attempts to protect their own sovereignty, not for coalition, not for supporting someone, but for the people of that states just deciding to live according to its own laws in their own country. It's just obvious that the will of citizens, it could just mean anything for the EU members only when its outcome allows to make a pawn out of a country in a bigger game. So the EU are just allowed actually everything, of course, for big sums of money. We have drawn attention to a copy of a letter of a high-ranking official, EU official, of an anti-government statement allegedly for the interests of Georgia, that the freedom-loving citizens had to pronounce at another meeting. And one of the opposition figures just read that text received from the EU just exactly in the Georgian language, the text received from Brussels. So they just reveal the mechanics of the EU members in other states. They do not have any right for that. So there is, in conclusion, the more concessions a country makes to the West, the more the Western appetite grows. So as for Armenia, it's heavily supplied with grants, with promises. Russophobia is cultivated. Now it's observation, but actually it's intelligence mission in Armenia. They engage the republic into its own political military orbit. They want to destroy the multi-century friendship of Russian and Armenian people. So just the formula proposed to the South Caucasus countries actually openly, just to be like Moldova and Ukraine, it's anti-advertisement for Euro integration. And they just offered to just aspire to that. To aspire to what? To destroy the Ukrainian economy, the killings, the destruction of its public political life, the destruction of its independence and sovereignty, how citizens of Moldova are rewritten, how they are turned into Romanian citizens. So that should be taken as some role model for the South Caucasus states.
They want to turn them into vessels that are ready to abandon their national interests to benefit their sovereign. And as you know, this accelerated movement towards the EU prompted Ukraine into the abyss in 2013. This imposed Euro integration choice led to a murderous coup, followed by a protracted civil conflict. As a result, instead of a strong European Ukraine, as was promised, we got a degrading, corrupt, totalitarian Nazi state, or basically a terrorist state that carries out terrorist attacks. In Moldova, they enshrined the irreversible European course in 2024 in their constitution, and this gave a green light to Brussels to engage even further with the republic, to enslave it. And you know what it will all end up with? They will not invest in the economy and education. They will destroy Moldova from within. Despite the constitutionally enshrined neutrality of Moldova, they introduce it into Euro-Atlantic mechanisms and militarization. As a result, the republic is turning into a home front to provide for the criminal Kiev regime. We should not talk about the economic breakthrough of Moldova. The statistics is real. This policy by the EU only drags the country into the abyss of the crisis, and the investment of the EU is just a third of the budget, but you cannot live only by the injections of funds from abroad, because otherwise you end up being an appendage, or you name it. It's not an independent unit. Against this backdrop, there is an increasing zero tolerance of Euro path on behalf of the population. They impose it to Moldova. They used to impose it to Ukraine. This policy is a disaster for them. Bold News, are you here with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. In Lithuania, there are 43 centers of cybersecurity. There is also a NATO unit in Tallinn, which is in charge of cybersecurity of NATO. We've already said that Western countries are destroying the signs of information presence of Russia. And what role is played by the Baltic cyber centers? This is indeed a advanced experience center of excellence of NATO that is located in Tallinn. That is a training testing ground for offensive operations in digital space. It's no secret that all efforts of this entity are anti-Russian, and the center plays a key role in defense and implementing, developing the so-called hybrid defense policy in cyberspace. They train these approaches during such exercises as lock shields. They imitate cyber attacks in order to damage the infrastructure of our country. And it is noteworthy that Ukraine joined this center in 2022. How can you deal without it? Military men and security services and hackers that are serving on the Bankover Street get special training there. And this is just a sign that NATO is involved in the cyber attacks that are carried out by the Kiev regime against Russia. They could hardly be possible without the help of the Western mentors. There's no question about that. Thank you. Izvestia, are you here with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions for you. Okay, the first one. You, Prime Minister of Japan, Sanae Takaichi, started the confrontation against Russia from day one of her rule, and the same attitudes was shown with regard to China. Japan tried to mount provocations. Russia banned entry to its territory for the 30 Japanese citizens. How will it affect the bilateral relations between Russia and Japan? Let me highlight that probably the new Prime Minister of Japan does not know about that, but we take only response measures. If we're talking about the ban to enter Russia for 30 citizens, this is a response by our part. They were surprised to see Japanese diplomats in this list. I beg your pardon, but Russian diplomats are on the same list by Japan. We just simply took response measures. Judging by the public statements of the Prime Minister of Japan, the unfriendly course of Tokyo against Russia is still preserved, despite the statements by sane politicians, including the ones that used to be prime ministers, and their attitude. They believe that it is detrimental for Japan. Our position has not changed. Rebuilding dialogue with Tokyo is only possible if Tokyo refuses this anti-Russian course, if it stops attempts to deal a blow to Russia-Japanese cooperation, and to unblock bilateral ties. Thank you. A second question, if I may. What's the take of the Foreign Ministry on the situation when Ukrainian authorities talk about cleansing the system, but actually systems are exposed, these models involving hundreds of millions of dollars, engaging people close to Zelensky? Well, it's just not a scandal that's a story that reveals a massive embezzlement, millions or even billions of dollars that were distributed. I'm talking about weapons that are circulating in black markets, and this led to the political disaster in Ukraine, and the waves of this political shock reached the countries that have supplied the Kiev regime without any verification and audit, without any accounting. They supplied it with weapons and money, and we had no doubts even before that Western-bred Kiev regime has long mastered the art of embezzling the huge sums of money, military, financial, economic, and humanitarian assistance. This is the embezzlement of public funds and bribery that we're talking about. Previously, they used to have such problems, but currently, the scale is unparalleled. It has become a truly international mafia entity. I'm talking about these representatives on the Bankover street, and that is something that is closely associated with the governing machine in Ukraine. We're not just talking about individuals that used to steal something. We're talking about systemic driver in the state machine of Ukraine. It is closely linked to the Ukrainian political system, and it has ties with the external political actors. This scandal around the Mindich case exposed the model of stealing many millions allocated by the sponsors to the Kiev regime in order to strengthen its defense capacity, but in reality, they used it to fight against Russia, and now we can see this proof of embezzlement, and there will be even more questions regarding Zelensky. But I believe that the citizens of Western countries should ask their governments, first, why do they sponsor the Kiev regime? Secondly, where is the guarantee that this money will not be stolen? Third, where is the audit and verification systems? And fourth, this all has a terrorist component to it because the Zelensky regime carries out terrorist attacks against civilians and civil infrastructure. Thanks a lot, Madam Zakharova. Thank you, Xinhua News Agency. Are you here with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova, Xinhua News Agency. Recently, Japanese Prime Minister made provocative statements regarding Taiwan. She hinted that there is a possible military intervention in the Taiwan Strait. Despite the serious protest by China, Japan has not recognized its mistake. It refused to recall the statements that were made. Such actions by Japan is a serious violation by the international law and the norms of international relations. They significantly undermine the post-war world order. It is at odds with the One China principle and the spirit of four China-Japan political documents. What's your comment on that? Thank you. You said that Japan has not recognized its mistake so far. I'm sorry. Japan has not recognized the outcome of World War II. 80 years have passed. Japan still cannot recognize the outcome of World War II enshrined in the international law. Currently, Russia marks in various formats the 80th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. You see, these outcomes are sacred to us. Building upon these outcomes, we developed the international law in many aspects. Many notions were formed for the first time there. 80 years on, Japan not just celebrates this date and has some awareness events, it is not willing to recognize all of it, and it's not because it recognizes the outcome of trials that took place in the Far East, not at all. It does not recognize the outcome of World War II at all whatsoever, and you say that it does not recognize the modern mistakes. Just count 80 years from these mistakes, and we'll see in 80 years' times whether it recognizes these mistakes. We see that lately the Taiwan topic is actively discussed in the international media space, and it has to do with twisting of facts and reality that has nothing to do with the current state of affairs. A number of countries loudly claim their commitment to the One China principle. At the same time, they fuel tension in the Taiwan Strait. They stand in the way of the peaceful reunification of the country. They provide weapon supplies to Taiwan. They fuel separatist mood. They use this Chinese province, Taiwan, as a tool for pressure and geopolitical deterrence of the PRC. The set of tools resembles a lot the ones the West uses regarding Ukraine, that they use in Ukraine. As for the Russian principled stance on Taiwan case, it is well known, it has not been changed, it has been repeatedly enshrined at the summit level. I'm happy to once again repeat it. The Russian side recognizes that Taiwan is a part and parcel of China. We stand against independence of the country in any form. We assume that the Taiwanese case is a domestic affair of China. It has all the legitimate grounds to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia strongly condemns the hypocritical stance by the West regarding the PRC on the Taiwan file. As a genuine friend and credible partner of Beijing on the international arena, we are ready to provide firm support when it comes to sovereignty and territorial integrity of China, including Taiwan. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to you, Reuters. Are you here with us? Madam Zakharova, hello. We are here with you. Hello. We would like to ask you to comment on the recent statements by Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, at the conference organized by the Süddeutsche Zeitung. He said that the Western world order has come to an end, and the contours of this world order are not clear, and the shaping of the new world order is only possible with the participation of European neighbors of Germany. Is the Russian Foreign Ministry in agreement with that? And what's your vision of the new international security system? Well, for starters, we need to understand what exactly he meant. What did he mean by saying that the ordinary habitual state of affairs has come to an end? if we're talking about the UN-led international world order that is based on the main principles of the United Nations Charter, then we can say that it's not that it is coming to an end or might come to an end. It's that they have done their utmost to dismantle it. If we are talking about this habitual order, that is the order that's been shaped by the West to segregate people, to divide people into those who are entitled to have rights and freedoms, and the ones who can be exploited and used by all means. In this case, he should delve on that matter. Maybe he should seek repentance for this 100 years of ideology and say that, well, they refuse and reject this ideology. I would not dispute with him or agree with him or disagree. I believe that he needs to specify what exactly he meant. At the same time, we have our own opinion. This habitual order that is habitual to the West, the ones that they call the rules-based order, imposing rules, standards, and norms that are developed without equal participation of all interested parties. That is exactly the approach that Germany and its European, EU, and NATO allies have been advancing in relations with third countries, and they've been advocating this in the international arena. In other words, that is the order building upon the right of the might, with all the emanating consequences. Given the drastic transformation of the modern world, such world order, namely the rules-based order, is doomed. Hardly anyone can claim that he cannot see this trend, because Russia has been saying that for quite some time. As a result, the Euro-Atlantic system that is habitual to Germany is becoming a thing of the past. The European security concept has lost every sense. It has failed. Namely, it is visible in terms of Ukraine. Once the West has unleashed an unprovoked hybrid aggression against Russia, allegedly as a response to the special military operation, although it was in the works for quite some time, it became clear that the previous security model building upon the Euro-Atlantic institutions ceased to exist. It simply collapsed. And current security system in Europe, while they try to make it seem that they created without Russia, but actually they built it against Russia. And the central element to that, as they see it, is the entirely hostile NATO bloc, hostile towards Russia, because this was the initial goal when it was first developed. That was stated by Friedrich Merz. At the same time, they accelerate the militarization of the EU, and there are bold statements that are made that soon there will be a big war against Russia. At the same time, NATO countries and the EU try to turn Eurasia into an arena of geopolitical confrontation, and the goal of these destructive actions is to preserve their dominance, as they believe that it is everlasting, but we believe that it has already faded away. And against this backdrop, Russia believes that our strategic framework and guideline is to shape a flexible and sustainable architecture of equal and indivisible security and cooperation in Eurasia that would fit modern challenges. That is the initiative proposed by President Putin of Russia. The all-Eurasian continental approach provides for account for legitimate aspirations of all Eurasian states and building upon the fair balance of these aspirations. That is the idea behind Russia-Belarus idea of the European Charter of Diversity and Multipolarity in the 21st century. That is to outline the principles of interstate communication and security. As you know, Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov, came up with these proposals at the third Minsk Conference on Eurasian Security. We will definitely provide you with the link And we're also talking about other materials that you can study in the section Eurasian Security. We'll provide you with the link.
So if we have a broader look, Russia has a clear idea of the image of the future in the concept of foreign policy of the Russian Federation. It's the framework task of forming a multipolar world order and its desirable parameters. We have already mentioned its key principles. I would repeat them: sovereign equality of states, non-interference in domestic affairs of independent countries, the right to choose the model of its development, and cultural and linguistic diversity, civilizational diversity of the world. Thank you very much, Madam Zakharova. Thank you very much. Is news.ru with us? Yes, news.ru is with you. We have two questions. The first one, just a second. Trump has supported the idea of sanctions against the trade partners of Russia. So far it have been statements, but how would Moscow react if such statements become a practice? So we have repeatedly stated that we comment on specific facts. Rhetoric can change even now in the United States of America, especially now. But it's about the harmful nature of illegitimate restrictive measures for the entire world economy and the prosperity of the countries themselves, the countries we qualify as sanctions aggressors, is becoming more and more evident with time, and it's just hostile policy towards our country. In the American establishment, there are still many people who count on the detained effect of the restrictions against us. They count on the results with the work with the third countries on countering Russia, tightening the sanctions regime against Russia, and then face the denial of the hegemonist aspirations, but actually they do not see the reality. We have just been taught not only to survive, but to live and to develop. On multiple occasions, we have noted that it's just harmful for them, this denial of the reality, just to rest on the laurels that have already disappeared, to count on their dominant positions and just ignoring the interests of those who surround them, ignoring the situation in the world. It's just misguiding for them. The growing number of players who base on different models of development, countries, political figures, and journalists, is just disgusting for them. Those calls not to buy something from Russia and to buy something from someone else. You just imagine, you go to a shop, you need a specific list of products. You know that a certain supplier is in the shop and you have actually a discount. And when someone from some corner, from some loudspeaker, they are crying out loud, just put this pack back, do not touch it. At the payment cashier point, you will just be made to leave this product and we will provide you our own products, but it will be even more expensive, much more expensive. It's not just total control, it's total idiotism that is imposed under the disguise of some scientific, technical progress, democracy, and so on. Actually, Orwell describes this as dictatorship, as totalitarian system. But it was just presented as a system that is not so hypocritical. It just did not conceal. It did not disguise itself as some other things. It did not conceal its true aspirations. But now it's more complicated. As totalitarian practices, they are disguised as some liberalist practices, and it's not all, because American dictatorship, it just speeds up the processes of diversification, reforming of production change, and currency reforms and reforms of payments. So just disruption of dollar payment. They're just prohibiting themselves to use dollar and some payment systems. It has become commonplace for them, but it's a flagrant violation of international law, because our country is a major exporter of the products and the energy resources much in demand globally. And it's difficult to predict how global market will react to additional sanctions and customs duties. We will continue to develop our economic ties with the interested states based on our own interests and not intimidations from the third countries. Our next question is about France this year not inviting again our representatives to a ceremony dedicated to the end of the First World War. How will we react on, what will our reaction be? Should our country participate in similar events, even if our country at some moment is invited there? Yes, I would confirm that, as Paris once again did not invite our representatives to the celebration, the ceremony for the First World War.
Back in April, defense media outlet Janes reported that Indonesia was considering a Russian request to base its military aircraft in eastern Indonesia. The report sparked widespread concern in Australia and was subsequently denied by Indonesia, with Jakarta stating that no such request had been made or considered. Is there a connection between this report and the bilateral security treaty just signed between Australia and Indonesia, the second treaty Canberra has signed in back-to-back months? What is the overriding factor in Australia driving these treaties? And what does this development mean for regional security? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ika Vat. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Alex Tan, University of Canterbury, New Zealand Political Science and International Relations Professor, and Patrick Zoll, Neue Zürcher Zeitung Indo-Pacific Geopolitics Correspondent. Alex, Patrick, a very warm welcome to Taiwan Talks today. Standing aboard the HMAS Canberra in Sydney Harbour, Anthony Albanese and Prabowo Subianto announced a bilateral security treaty which commits both Australia and Indonesia in this way.
If either or both countries' security is threatened, to consult and consider what measures may be taken, either individually or jointly, to deal with those threats. This is a watershed moment in the Australia-Indonesia relationship.
As close neighbors, our determination to maintain the best of relationship in order to enhance and guarantee the security of both our countries.
Alex, so if I can come to you first, we'll get into the details of what we think this treaty might cover. But firstly, let's deal with this Russian report. Do you believe that there is a link between it and this security treaty?
It could have some link for sure. And primarily when we think of Australia's concern about the northern border, which is Indonesia, right? So Australia has always been concerned about its security, rightly so. And in the past, relationship with Indonesia sometimes is testy. So this is important to build trust between the two countries.
Would it fear that Russia could do?
Well, this base where supposedly the Russians want to base their airplanes is about 1,000 kilometers away from Australia's north coast. That sounds like a lot, but these planes can fly 10,000 kilometers. And in the north, there's Australian military bases. There's American Marines training there. There's a Air Force base where there's talk about basing B-52, American B-52 bombers, and they all will be well in range of these airplanes, mostly for surveillance, but in case of a war, also for bombing. Maybe if I just can add something here, why is Indonesia, why is the North so important for Australia? There's a word in Australia, it's called the Northern Approaches. Because if you look at the world from Australia, there's nothing in the west, there's nothing in the south but penguins, and there's nothing in the east. And in the north, you have Indonesia, you have Papua New Guinea, you have land masses from where a threat could come. And that's why it's so important for Australia to work with Indonesia.
Okay. Alex, James's reputable agency, of course, Indonesia denied that there was any request from Russia, denied that they were even considering it. But what do you think was actually behind this story?
Well, I think, when a story, James is a reputable institution.
They talked to Indonesian government sources and they looked at a document.
Because if there's no doubt that the report is probably something's brewing there. The question is, how far has that agreement been done between the two sides, right? We have to understand that Indonesia has always, while they do not use the word strategic autonomy, Indonesia has always tried to do this multi-alignment, right? So the so-called free,
or
independent,
non-alignment,
or non-alignment, right? So this idea of free, independent, active foreign policy that's what they do. Try to be, as Prabhu have said in many times, and I paraphrase, kind of like friend to all and enemy to none. Kind of like that concept.
Right. Okay. So on that theme, Prabowo Subianto's non-alignment policy is best expressed through his often quoted saying, 1,000 friends are too few, one enemy is too many. Indonesians refer to it as their free and active foreign policy, as Alex mentioned. Though Prabowo has just signed a common security treaty with Australia, Indonesia has also taken part in humanitarian exercises with China and naval exercises with Russia, and become the first Southeast Asian nation to join BRICS, which is positioned as an alternative to Western-led blocs. In June, Prabowo visited Moscow and signed a declaration on strategic partnership with Vladimir Putin. And during China's massive PLA military parade in September, Prabowo was granted a privileged position alongside Putin, China's Xi Jinping, and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. So, Patrick, since Indonesia is not aligned, how did Canberra manage to get it to sign this bilateral security treaty?
Well, it's something Australia has been wanting for a long time, and they had agreements before. They had one in 1995, which fell apart in 1999 when Australia helped to create stabilization, when they helped to stabilize East Timor. And then they basically picked up the pieces over the past few years and tried to work together again. It's for Australia, it's not the only treaty. They do also with PNG, but this one is on a relatively low level, I would say. And the word of trust building, I think, is important. Trust was lacking for a very long time. And although this treaty doesn't oblige the two sides to do a lot, if you have regular meetings, and these meetings are on both ministerials as well as leaders level, so they will both meet regularly and exchange their views, and that can create trust.
Right. Okay, so what we're talking about is that watershed moment, Alex, is about the building of trust. I mean, it seems that neither side really commits much to each other, just simply to have dialogue.
Yes, it's important though, because if you think of what happened in 1995, right? The abandonment of the 1995 treaty, you have to start somewhere. And I think this is a good step as far as the current Albanese government's attention to Indonesia. And, you know, as Patrick mentioned a while ago, the Northern Approaches idea, Australia has always been very, very concerned about that part. And you can just see within Australia itself, like they do spend resources in understanding Indonesia, you know, so, but, you know, with the breakdown of, you know, Australia's stabilization force in Timor-Leste, you know, and we also have to understand these are two states, middle power states that have ambitions to be regional leaders as well, you know, so having them work together is particularly important.
Do you think it could be almost a new model, that it doesn't need to be an alliance as such, it can be based on consultation? Dialogue?
And for a country like Indonesia, right? I mean, they've always, you know, tried to be as non-aligned as possible, and, you know, I mean, it's a good step to go to. And it in a way, it gives Australia this ability to know that whatever happens in that northern part, they will be consulted, right? So that's no surprise idea.
Okay, so perhaps, Patrick, that the point is that something like this Russian incident or you know, request just would not happen again because there would be consultation. Is that correct?
Well, we haven't seen the text yet. It's not public. So my understanding is that Australia would expect this, but I don't think there is a hard wording that the Indonesians have to tell it, to say it. It is on a very low level, and the treaty is going to be as good as people, and not just Prabowo and Albanese now, but the following leaders will act upon it. It could be a piece of paper not worth much, or it could build on that and establish a very close connection and exchange of information.
And Alex, sort of to understand what each side gains from this treaty, which, as Patrick said, we don't have the details, but we do. We have been told that it's about this dialogue and this consultation. Let's first deal with Indonesia's relations with both Russia and China. How would you characterize, firstly, China?
Its relation with China is quite steady, very solid. If you can see that the optics, right, of Prabowo being invited, pride of place during the September military parade in China. Also, they're part of BRICS. They also have BRI investments. China is building their, if I'm not mistaken, they're building their high-speed
railway, yes.
Yeah, so, and if I'm not mistaken, 2012, 2013, China and Indonesia has a comprehensive strategic partnership. So it's the highest form of foreign relations. So yeah, their interaction is quite steady, even at the security side, the Haidar side, quite extensive.
But there's also tension, though, isn't it? That
there will always be, you know, in a way, because of the Natuna Island situation, right? So
this is in the South China Sea? Yeah,
just a little bit south of the South China Sea. But yes, I mean, there always this prevailing tension, and historically as well, right? And we think of from the 50s to the 60s, when the CCP was, actively in the idea of supporting communist movements and stuff like that. So, they've gone past that, but
have they? Is it not a constant source of friction?
Well, I won't say it's a constant source of friction, but there's always just behind the mind, right?
Okay, Patrick, would you like to comment on
with China? Well, in regards with Australia, if you say a securities treaty, you have a common threat perception. That's definitely not the case. Australia sees China as a threat, whereas Indonesia does not. Yeah. And that's probably the tricky part in this treaty.
Are we saying that as a blanket it does not? Does it see it as a threat, perhaps in the South China Sea?
Well, Indonesia is not a claimant of any features in the South China Sea. There's an overlap between the Indonesian maritime zones and the 9-dash line.
The North Natuna Sea.
Yes, and there has been some clashes with illegal fishing, but that's not dominating the relationship. Yes, there are problems there, and Alex mentioned historical issues with the support for communism. But
it's affecting oil drilling, though, isn't it, in that sea?
Yes, but it's not dominating the relationship. So for Indonesia, there's so much more in this relationship that they say, okay, it is a big neighbor. It's a neighbor who will always be there. We have to deal with it, but it's not. We don't see it as a major threat, which whereas Australia does see China as a major threat.
Alex, if you want to talk about the relationship between Indonesia and Russia.
Indonesia and Russia, they've always been cordial, I would say, and part of the reason also is if as a non-aligned nation, that relationship has been quite long. Russia is also actually a supplier of arms to Indonesia. So from the security perspective, they've had an extensive relationship. China's relationship is much broader than the Russian relationship. It's economics, it's security, much broader. For the fact that China now is the second largest economy in the world, with it's able to do that, right?
What's the security relationship with China?
With they do a lot of HADAR exercises, for example. There have been reports recently about the Indonesian defense minister talking about considering that China might buy the J-10 Chinese fighter. It's not been confirmed. Every time that report comes out, everyone backtracks and say, well, it's not confirmed yet, So, but there is this talk about probably, how should I say, diversifying the Indonesian source of their weaponry.
Interesting also, though, that is apparently had been considering the BrahMos missile.
Yes.
Which is Russian-Indian.
Yes. Yes. So it's really interesting. The Indonesian military has many different platforms. So I think the question for me is, how do they operationalize?
They have like 5 air forces at the same time.
Yeah, different planes, different countries.
Right. And so now that we've got that background, Patrick, so what does each side, Indonesia, Australia, gain from this treaty?
Well, from the Australian point of view, I think it's mainly to have this constant channel of if something like that Russian base comes up again, they can at least say, hey, we have this treaty, we would like to sit down and talk. And the Indonesians need a reason not to do it. For Indonesia, it's probably also a bit of prestige. They can say, hey, we're bigger than just ASEAN. Well, we are the big guy in ASEAN to start out with, and they insist on that quite a bit. But they can say, hey, we act more regionally. And from the Indonesian point of view, it's this hedging, or you use the word multi-alignment. I think in this context, it's better than non-alignment. You go to operate in Beijing, you buy planes from Moscow, and you have an agreement with Australia, and you do a yearly Garuda Shield exercises with the US. It's friends with everybody, you engage with everybody. Obviously, the Australians would like to have Indonesia as a very close friend, but it's still better to have Indonesia in this balancing position than Indonesia going too close to China.
And there's something I want to add, though, in that as well. Besides the military issues, right, there are a lot of common issues that the two countries face, particularly in the maritime space. The issue of smuggling, the issue of all these illegal piracy in the high seas and all of that stuff. And I think, Australia definitely is most concerned about that too. I'm sure Indonesia is as well. You don't want porous maritime borders between the two. So coordination of the two countries in that aspect is only good for both.
Okay, so from the perspective of Australia, this month there is the announcement of the Indonesia Treaty. Last month there was the signing of the Puk-Puk Treaty with Papua New Guinea. With the Philippines, Australia has also advanced an enhanced defense cooperation agreement and visiting forces agreement. Meanwhile, with Japan, over the past few years, Australia has signed both a reciprocal access agreement for their forces and a joint declaration on security cooperation. So Patrick, taking these defense agreements as a whole, how do we see, because we've identified, that China is a security challenge or threat for Canberra, how do we see Canberra strengthening its defenses with these that we've picked out against China?
So again, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea is these closest landmasses to Australia. And Papua New Guinea is a former colony of Australia. At the closest point, and when you're Australia, you don't have a lot of close neighbors, but the closest point between the last Australian island and Papua New Guinea is, I think, 3-4 kilometers. It's the only close neighbor they actually have. So that one is, and again, if from an Australian point of view, if there were a Chinese military base or a close military cooperation between PNG and China, that would be a nightmare scenario. Because to the northeast are these shipping lines which go to the US. If there is any conflict, that's where your aid would come from. So Australia is trying to secure these northern approaches and to multi-align, you could also say, with different countries, like-minded countries, as they call them. The Philippines is a treaty ally of the US, like Australia is itself, Japan, the same. So this hub and spokes, the hub doesn't work so well right now, so the spokes have to work together well more.
That's a good
Right.
point.
And Alex, is it also about sort of pushing that defense line further north, isn't it?
Yes, yes, definitely is. And again, you don't want, Australia don't want to be surprised, right, on this northern side, correct? You know, speaking of the Pukpuk Treaty, for example, I recently spoke to a scholar at PNG. You know, PNG has always been asking Australia for a long time for a treaty, you know, for a long time. But in the past, Australia was not as interested. And PNG is very, very aware that it has its own security consideration, particularly on the West Papua side, you know. But, you know, in an alliance, when you do sign a mutual defense treaty, you know, the partners are always worried about two things. Number one, being abandoned. Number two, being entangled, you know. So from the Australia side, they have to consider, am I going to be entangled, you know, if I sign a treaty with PNG? But because PNG has a comprehensive strategic partnership with China as well, you know, and China is involved in many of the economic development side of it. So naturally, I think Australia wants to, you know, is now interested.
So it's to kind of like to prevent a vacuum that China could fill.
Well, I think it could be that, but it certainly wants to make sure that that there's no surprises there, right? So if they sign, now that they have a mutual defense pact with PNG, then it secures that side of what Patrick was talking about, the northern side, right?
And there's a certain frustration in some countries in the Pacific that until China showed up, the Australians didn't really care. And now, the Chinese are here, we have to do something.
And it's part of the so-called step up, right? So the Pacific step up. So using that term is actually interesting because if there was a step up, it means to say that in the past you stepped down.
Okay. And I wanted to talk about, so the fear that Australia has. I mean, what is the direct threat from China?
Well, one is the sea lines of communication, and the north again. Almost anything Australia exports, which is mostly raw materials, iron ore, coal, agricultural goods, they go somewhere north, either Northeast Asia, North America, or even if you go westwards toward the Suez Canal, it's northwest. Again, everything which comes in comes from the north.
So as Indonesia controls those?
Most of Indonesia, and more to the east, it's PNG, Solomon Islands, the East, Western Pacific, yes.
Okay. In a recent National Press Club event, the Japanese ambassador to Australia, Kazuhiro Suzuki, called for a more equilateral security triangle with the US by deepening defense ties between Japan and Australia. He also said that the two countries were allies in all but name. Take a look.
Our bilateral relationship is defined as special strategic partnership. And why? Japan regards cooperation with Australia as the central pillar of coordination among like-minded countries. Australia's national defense strategy describes Japan as an indispensable partner. It is also why our relationship is often described as being allies in all but name.
So, Alex, would you agree with that? Allies in all but name?
Yes, to a certain extent, because the word allies is quite tricky, right? If you say that you're allies, there is a commitment for mutual defense, and I'm not sure that part is necessarily achieved. But yes, I mean, they're very, very close. They're in Quad. They have other exercises, and the common part here is what the ambassador mentioned, right? Both Japan and Australia are actually treaty allies of the United States. So the call that I hear is more of what I would call middle power agency, right? Because the issue is right now, so when he uses the word equilateral security triangle, I'm not sure whether that third angle is really engaged right now. They're too busy domestically. So that's one reason why the middle powers have to do something, right? Because they cannot just let the security situation decay. They also have to maintain, a regional order that will sustain regional economic growth. So that makes sense.
So that's a very good point, Patrick. If that's the final question, how much is this? We talked about Australia having all these, defense arrangements. How much of it is also the Trump administration and maybe uncertainty around that?
Well, Australia is definitely worried about the Trump administration. Well, I think everybody is. But they have traditionally fear of abandonment, being at the end of the world. On the other hand, they put in a lot which is in interest of the US. One example is this new submarine base which is being built in the Western Australia, which gives the United States much, much better access to the Indian Ocean. So Australia has quite a few things to put to the table. Unfortunately, President Trump looks always only at one or two indicators, defense spending or your trade deficit, and he doesn't seem to see the whole picture. In the whole picture, I think Australia is in a relatively good position. The question is, does President Trump see it that way?
I think what I see is when these middle powers start acting, is that for a long time we've always talked about the international relations of Asia Pacific. We don't have a formal security framework. Maybe this time around the middle powers can start talking first, and then see what we can come up with, because there are definitely lots of interested partners here. It's not just Japan, it's not just Australia. You have South Korea, New Zealand, Indonesia. Everybody's vested in the stability of the region, right? So outside of the two great powers, there is room for the smaller nations, the middle powers, the small states, to come up with a framework that works, because the region is not only China's or the United States, it's ours. We live in the region, so we have a stake in the region and its stability.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Alex Tan and Patrick Zoll, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.
I'm Barry Ritholtz. You're listening to Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio. Today, I have an extra special guest. His name is Neil Katyal. He is the former Solicitor General of the United States for the Obama administration. He is a legendary appellate attorney. He has argued more cases in front of the Supreme Court than I want to say any living attorney these days. He's currently a partner at Milbank, where he's a member of the firm's litigation and arbitration group. He pretty much has won every award there is to win as an appellate litigator. He is a recipient of the highest civilian award by the U.S. Department of Justice. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court appointed him multiple times to the Advisory Committee on Federal Appellate Rules. He's been named Litigator of the Year, top 50 lawyers, most influential lawyers in D.C. On and on it goes. Rather than just read you his CV, let me say, Neil Katyal, welcome to Bloomberg.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. You couldn't possibly be more relevant to this moment in time with what's going on in terms of policy and politics and jurisprudence. But before we get to that, let's spend a little time just talking about your background and career. Dartmouth undergrad, JD from Yale. What was the original career plan?
The original plan was for me to be a professor of history.
Really?
And I went to Dartmouth College, as you noted. I probably was one of the last kids admitted to Dartmouth. I was not a particularly great high school student. And I had this professor, Doug Haynes, in history at Dartmouth, who basically taught me to write and taught me how to think. And I was so grateful to him. And I felt like I should do that with my life, is go and give back in the way that Doug had given me this incredible gift. And so in my senior year, I say to Doug, I was like, I ask him to have lunch with me, and I say, I'd really like to be a history professor. And frankly, you're the one who inspired me, and I want to do this. And he thought about it, and he said, honestly, Neil, I don't think you should be a history professor because it's really tough and it's hard to get tenure, and you'll have to start in some, small town in the middle of nowhere. It's hard to meet a spouse and so on. He said, look, at that point I was a national champion debater. And he said, my advice to you is to go to law school. And in particular, he said, go to Yale Law School, which is known for creating law professors. And you can do all the same stuff you want to do, but as a law professor, where you would get paid 3 times, it's easier to get tenure. Your life is a lot easier. So I did that. I applied to Yale Law School. I got in, again, probably one of the last kids admitted. And at the law school, I had these incredible professors who did the same thing that Doug Haynes did for me in history in other areas, constitutional law and criminal law and the like. And these incredible professors who taught me, again, how to think and how to write. And so I was committed to being a law professor. I clerked first for Guido Calabresi, who was the dean of the Yale Law School, who was put on the Court of Appeals, and then for Justice Stephen Breyer. But all through that time, I knew I wanted to be a law professor. So I applied while I was clerking to teach. And at the age of, I think, 26 years old, I took a job teaching at Georgetown Law. And that was the plan for my life, to be a law professor and nothing but a law professor.
And do you still do any teaching these days?
I do. And I love it. And in many ways, it's my favorite job I've ever had. But there's a lot else going on in the world these days. And so, it was a little bit by accident that I fell into this litigation thing. Yes, I was a national champion debater, and so I was comfortable being on my feet. But I was really, my dominant thinking was be a law professor, write these theoretical articles that change the way people think about the law, and teach students. So that's what I thought I was going to do. And then something happened, which was... we had the horrific attacks on September 11th, and I was bumbling around trying to figure out what to do. I was teaching at Yale Law School that year, and my students and we decided to try and help first responders get benefits and stuff. And we weren't particularly good at it, but it was something. And then President Bush announced that he was going to have these military trials at Guantanamo Bay for suspected terrorists. And I looked at that. I'd served in the Justice Department briefly, and we had the embassy bombings of Al-Qaeda at the time. And so I looked into, could we have military trials? And we concluded they were obviously unconstitutional. So I went and looked up, what's President Bush doing here? What's his source of authority for this? And, it wasn't particularly compelling. In fact, it was really weak. Because the president was saying he was going to set up these trials from scratch. He was going to pick the prosecutors, pick the defense attorneys, write all the rules for the criminal trials, define the punishments and offenses, including the death penalty.
Seems even-handed and fair. Right. What's your objection?
Yeah. And, and even the last lines of the executive order said the courts have no business reviewing what I'm doing. There's no writ of habeas corpus. So I went into my constitutional law class and said, you guys always tease me because I think the president should have such strong powers and nothing the president does is unconstitutional. Well, here's something that's obviously unconstitutional. And in the class was a staffer for Senator Leahy, who was then the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And so she told him about me, and he had a hearing, and I testified and said, look, I don't know if you want to have these military trials or not, but the one thing I'm sure of is that it can't be done with the president's stroke of his pen. You need Congress to approve it. And this is, of course, going to be relevant as we talk about tariffs later. It's the exact same architecture of the argument. And so that's how I testified. Nobody listened. So then I go and I write a law review article with Lawrence Tribe, the nation's most preeminent constitutional law professor.
So you at Yale, Lawrence at Tribe at Harvard.
Yeah, exactly. And so we write this article in the Yale Law Journal. We race it to print saying what's going on is unconstitutional. Nobody reads the article. Maybe my mom read it, but, I don't know. So then I said to myself, you got this piece of paper, Neil, a law degree. You could actually sue the president. And that's
you
what I
needed
did.
a plaintiff, though, don't you?
Exactly. So that was the hard question, because a bunch of different interest groups had sued on Guantanamo, but they didn't have standing. They had no reason. And so I had a friend very high up at the Pentagon who got me the email address of a Pentagon lawyer who was representing the detainees. And I basically got a letter snuck to Guantanamo, and it wound up in the hands of Osama bin Laden's driver. And that became my client. And so I go from being a theoretical law professor to like a real, like hard-nosed litigator, all in the span of a few months. I filed the case. Nobody thinks we're going to win.
How far are you from law school now?
I'm like 6 years out.
So still relatively green.
Yeah, very green, and never filed a lawsuit, And so, by the way, I don't have any help except 4 law students who are helping me. I tried with law firms, and initially I couldn't get them, but then ultimately Perkins Coie, a Seattle firm, decided to help me, and that was phenomenal. So we filed this thing. Nobody thinks we're going to win. And we win it in the trial court. We lose it in the Court of Appeals with a guy named John Roberts on the dissent panel. 3 days later, he's nominated to the Supreme Court and then to the Chief Justiceship. So I have to ask the Supreme Court to hear this Guantanamo case. It's the most important case their new Chief Justice has ever decided. And I'm going to say, I'm trying to tell the Supreme Court the Chief Justice is wrong about this. Nobody thinks we're going to win. It's my first Supreme Court argument. I'm arguing against President Bush's legendary Solicitor General. It's his 35th argument. I work my tail off and we win. And then my life changes. And then companies want to hire me. And I meet a young senator named Barack Obama who heard me interviewed on an interview just like this one. Mm-hmm. And he calls me into the Senate and says, ask me to advise him on some things on Guantanamo, and tells me he's thinking of running for president. And then started working with him. And then my life changes massively.
Wow. That's amazing. I want to talk about a couple of the other cases that you argued. One was Moore versus Harper, which former Judge Michael Luddick called the most important case for American democracy ever. Tell us about that case.
Yeah, so that's a pretty recent one. I argued it, I think, about 3 years ago. And it involved something called the independent state legislature theory, which at that point was the greatest threat to democracy. I think when Judge Ludwig was writing those remarks, we've now had some things which, are arguably worse. But it was a significant one, because if you think back to the 2020 election, one of the things that President Trump tried to do then was to say that state legislatures can control elections, and you can even throw out the popular vote and just have state legislatures decide where the electoral votes will go to which candidate. And this became part of the RNC's playbook, and they invested heavily in state legislatures to try and develop, this theory. So we challenged that. Again, this is one in which nobody thought we could win, because if the Republicans won, they would entrench control over presidential elections for decades, probably. And a lot of people think, this Supreme Court, they're appointed by Republicans, they're very conservative, they're just going to do the Republican Party's bidding. And I looked at it and I said, I don't think that's right. I mean, this is a court that does have fidelity to the original understanding of the Constitution. And I thought, if we could make the argument in that way, and this is what my scholarship is all about, the original understanding of the Constitution, I said, I thought we could win. And so that's what I developed as the strategy. And indeed, I knew that Justice Clarence Thomas, would ask the first question at oral argument. That's been happening now for the last few years.
Just out of habit, or like, how does that come
he's
up?
One of the more senior justices. And during COVID, when we had to argue cases on speakerphones and we couldn't see each other, it went in order of seniority. And so Justice Thomas was right at the top. After COVID, that tradition continued in which Justice Thomas would ask the first question. And so I'd been thinking, how do I use that knowledge to my advantage? Justice Thomas was going to ask the first question. And what I did was I said to myself, okay, I can develop a set play. Justice Thomas is going to ask me a question. Doesn't matter what the question is. I'm then going to say, and this is what I do. Justice Thomas asked me a question at the argument. I don't remember what the question was. I answer it, and then I say, Justice Thomas, may I say, in nearly 3 decades of arguing before you, I've been waiting for this case because it speaks to your method of constitutional interpretation, the original understanding. And here are the 4 things you need to know about Moore versus Harper in the original understanding of the Constitution. And I get to talk about Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and so on. And it totally changes the dynamic in the courtroom. And sure enough, we win 6-3. this case, and the Republican theory is thrown out. I didn't win Justice Thomas's vote, but I won a bunch of others.
Huh, that's amazing. Let's quickly talk about the Voting Rights Act that you successfully defended instead of trying to overturn it. Tell us how different it is to be playing defense, or is it not? You're just arguing Constitution and law, and this is the outcome that should come about.
It is different, but I would say even back then I felt like I was playing defense. So this is a case I argued in maybe 2010. The Voting Rights Act had been passed in 1965. It literally has the blood of patriots on it. It is what Selma and the bridge, Patea's Bridge, is all about. And in the case, basically, it was right after President Obama had been elected, and Southern states said, look, we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore. Look, you have an African-American president. Like, that's proof that we don't need it. And I stood up in court and said, no, we do need it. And it's like, the very fact that we've been able to have an African-American president isn't alone enough to say there isn't discrimination in voting, particularly in particular areas, even if the overall national result is one thing. And the Supreme Court at that point accepted that argument. And 4 years later, however, in a case called Shelby County, they reversed that position and struck down that part of the Voting Rights Act. And now there's only one part of the Voting Rights Act that remains, Section 2, and the Supreme Court's agreed to hear a case to challenge that this fall. And so we very well may have a world in which there is no Voting Rights Act left whatsoever, which is a very dangerous thing. And yes, I do think the court has become more conservative over my lifetime. I mean, the court has always been majority Republican appointees since, I think,
so 1972. This isn't just partisanship. This is a ideological tilt, not necessarily a party tilt.
Yeah, so I would say, that the presidents now of both parties are sending to the Supreme Court more sure things. Mm-hmm. In which the track record is really known. The Republicans had this mantra, no more suitors, because David Souter, nominated by Republican President Bush, upheld things like abortion rights and so on. And the Democrats, I think, have had their own version of this for some time as well. And so we don't tend to get justices without very defined positions anymore. Like when I started arguing, Justice Kennedy was on the court, and you could see, Barry, every time you argued, he was struggling with which is the right view of the law. And he's a very smart man. It wasn't that he wasn't smart. When I say struggling, it's not that he was struggling intellectually.
They were pretty even-handed arguments on both sides. Yeah, and he really took the arguments so seriously without caricaturing them and just tried to make the right decision. And certainly that still happens today. I don't mean to overclaim it, but I would say in particularly some of the big cases, they're coming in a bit more with their minds made up than when I first started. After we recorded our conversation, a federal appeals court ruled on Friday that many of President Trump's most punishing tariffs were illegal. Neil and I spoke again after that ruling. He represented the small businesses that brought the case. First off, Neil, congratulations. You just won a major appellate case in U.S. elections versus Donald Trump. So congrats.
Thank you so much. I think I saw you and we had our interview the day before the decision came down. The way the Court of Appeals works, like the U.S. Supreme Court, they never tell you in advance when a decision's coming down. And indeed, it was a little, I think, past 5 o'clock on Friday, right before Labor Day, and I was about to leave the office, and then I heard my email ding, and I look at it, and I'm like, well, I might as well see what this is. I assumed it was just some, minor thing. And I'm like, whoa, it's the decision. And, Barry, they let me know the decision at the very same time they let the world know, because otherwise, if they let me know in advance, that's private information. This is the kind of information that does move markets. And so they let the entire world know, including me, at the very same time.
So let's put this into a little timeline. We had our recording Wednesday, August 27th. The decision dropped around 5 o'clock on Friday, August 29th. Today is Sunday, August 31st. Everybody else is on the beach. I know you're leaving for Europe in a couple of days, but I wanted to just touch base with you and try and figure out where this goes from here. So let's start out with the decision. I thought the majority decision, 7-4 your way, I thought it was a pretty powerful refutation of the executive's ability to just impose tariffs. I don't want to say on a whim, but lacking the specific following of the IEEPA rules and what an emergency actually is. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the 7 judges in the majority were saying exactly what we've said all along, which is maybe these tariffs are a good idea, maybe they're a bad idea, but they can't be imposed by the president's pen alone. You got to go to Congress and get that authorization. That's our constitutional system. And what the 7 judges said is that's exactly right, that the Congress has never given the president such a sweeping power to just do it on his own. And if they did, they said it'd be unconstitutional. But they said that isn't what's going on here. And the president has an easy fix. If he wants to, he could go to Congress and seek approval for the tariffs that he wants. That's what he did the first time around. And as we talked about last week, that's something that failed in Congress. And so maybe that's why he doesn't want to do it. Obviously, these tariffs are highly unpopular. But nonetheless, the Congress is controlled by his party. And that's the place to start. Don't run to the federal courts to do what you can't do in Congress.
So I want to talk about the dissent in a bit, but let's just talk about what the appellate court did, which I was somewhat confused by. Maybe you can clarify this. They remanded back to the International Court of Trade in DC, which is a U.S. Court, for findings about who this applies to. Like, it seems sort of odd to say, well, it only might apply to the litigants. What are we going to have? 7 million cases on this tariffs? It would seem that either it's constitutional or unconstitutional, and that applies to everybody, or am I being naive?
I think that's basically right, Barry, that I think ultimately the question is, are these tariffs legal or illegal? If, as the Court of Appeals said, they're illegal, then the vast, vast majority of Trump's tariffs are unconstitutional, illegal, can't be imposed, and people who've had them imposed, may have remedies and recourses. What the court also did, though, and you're referring to a fairly technical part of the decision, is it sent a case back to the lower court to evaluate the scope of the remedies. And that's because the U.S. Supreme Court, just very recently in the birthright citizenship case, has announced some new ways of thinking about relief on parties, in particular in class actions and things like that. And so I think the Federal Circuit did the prudent thing here by just saying, with respect to that, we'd like the lower court to evaluate it. I think that's pretty much a sideshow at this point. My strong hunch is that the federal government has a strong interest in resolving this question. After all, this is a really, an initiative of President Trump's that's been declared unconstitutional. So I think they're going to go to the Supreme Court. I mean, again, I wish that weren't the case. I wish they'd go to Congress, which is the way that our Constitution commands things. But, according to the president's tweets and the like, they want to go to the Supreme Court.
So what is the process like for this to go up to SCOTUS? First, the remand back to the district court, not relevant. That's just a very specific remedy question. Assuming the petition for certiorari is filed by the government, what are the options? What might the Supreme Court do?
Yeah, so I think you're right to say that the lower court proceedings on relief are irrelevant here. Indeed, the Federal Circuit said that lower court has no role, at least until October 14th, because they wanted to give the government time to file what's called a petition for certiorari, which is a formal request to the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. The government is saying that in these tweets by the president and others, that they will file that petition for certiorari, ask the Supreme Court to hear the case. And then it's obviously up to the Supreme Court to decide. Statistically, when the government asks them to hear a case, particularly one that has important consequences, the court does hear the case. So the court very well may set the case for oral argument, and then there'll be the argument from the two sides as to whether or not this lower court decision that we won declaring President Trump's tariffs unconstitutional, whether that will be upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court.
So I was kind of intrigued by the dissents, which I'm not a practicing attorney anymore, so I'm not up to date in what is the latest thinking in terms of art. But it sort of seemed like one of the dissents suggested that it's an emergency if the president declares it an emergency. Kind of makes that word meaningless. How did you read the significance of the dissent, and what might it mean to the hearing if this ultimately goes to the Supreme Court?
I think that's exactly right, what you're saying, which is if the dissent were right, it basically reads the word emergency out of the statute. It gives carte blanche deference to the president. And the Supreme Court, in an earlier case back in 1911, said you can't do that with the word emergency. And here, I think, Barry, the other really important point is that the law that the president is citing, IEPA, doesn't just talk about emergency. It requires it to be unusual and extraordinary. And the president's own executive order, when he imposed these tariffs, said that the trade deficits were persistent and gone on for 50 years. They're the opposite of unusual and extraordinary. And look, of course, you want the president in a genuine, true emergency that's unusual and extraordinary to have extra powers, because if Congress can't meet to repel some threat or something like that, you want the president to have some gap-filling power. This is the opposite of that. I mean, Congress is in session, they're passing bill after bill and the like, and of course, they're controlled by the same political party as the president. So the idea that Congress can't act is, to use the technical legal term, poppycock.
All right, so let's broaden this out a little bit. I think this is an important case because I'm a market participant, and tariffs are a tax, they're a headwind to consumer spending and other economic activities. But stepping back and looking at this from a constitutional standard, how much of this is focusing on how much authority the executive branch of the U.S. government has? Is this an attempt to rebalance the three parts of government by this particular president? Or is this just, no, we want our tariffs and we want to stop all these bad things that the tariffs will cure?
Yeah, I view this decision not as a rebalancing of our constitutional separation of powers, but rather a return to what our founders' original concept was, which was Congress makes the laws, the president enforces them, the courts decide whether those laws are legal or not. And here, what happened is you had a president who colored well outside of the lines and asserted an extraordinary power that no president in American history has ever asserted on his own. And I think the court is doing here what the courts have done time immemorial in other cases, whether it was the seizure of the steel mills by President Truman in 1952, whether it was President Bush's law-free zone at Guantanamo after the horrific 9/11 attacks, whether it was President Biden's student loan initiative programs. In all of these cases, you've had presidents that try and assert muscular powers, and the court pushes back on them. And this is, I think, a pretty extreme illustration of a president who's asserting powers that he has no business asserting.
So at the appellate level, it was 7-4. The dissent was written by a justice appointed by President Obama. It's kind of a little bit surprising to me. When you look at the lay of the Supreme Court, I know a lot of people tend to look at that as Democrats versus Republicans, but the appellate attorneys I know and the people who are constitutional lawyers tend to look at it as originalists versus more modern interpreters. How are you looking at this case when it gets, assuming it goes up to the Supreme Court? How are you looking at the context of this case?
I love the question because, oftentimes people say things like, well, the Supreme Court is appointed by Republicans, so they only wrote Republican, or nonsense like that. That's just not my experience. I mean, I've been lucky to argue 52 cases there, and I just don't see it in the same way as those kind of pundits see it. And, I think you're right to say the decision by the 7-4 court's a good illustration of that. The dissent written by a judge who was appointed by a Democratic president. Our majority opinion, the senior most judge in the majority, is Judge Lurie, who was appointed by President Bush, but says that these tariffs are unconstitutional. So I don't think it's the right way to think about it. I think that there are people who take constitutional limits more seriously and others who want to defer and avoid getting the courts in the middle of something. And so maybe that's one axis that sometimes could be used to predict outcomes. But here, I think no matter which way you look at it, the president just doesn't have this power. We might wish he had this power. It might be a good idea for him to have this power. But our founders were as clear as day in Article 1, Section 8. They said specifically the power over duties is one given to the Congress, not to the president.
So there are a couple of key issues this is going to turn on. The constitutionality, Article 1, Section 8, the IEPA laws, and what is an emergency. Any other factors that might drive this that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. One is that the Supreme Court in recent years has announced something called the Major Questions Doctrine. And the idea of that doctrine is to say, if Congress is giving the president some sort of power, they don't hide it in vague terms. They say it really expressly and clearly. Justice Scalia's phrase is that Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes. And at the oral argument, I took that to even further. I said, this isn't just an elephant in a mouse hole. It's a galaxy in a keyhole. It's an extraordinary set of powers given to the president that claimed by the president. And, this doctrine, Major Questions Doctrine, has been used, Barry, by the U.S. Supreme Court repeatedly to strike down President Biden's initiatives, whether it's over greenhouse gases or whether it's over student loans or whether it was over COVID eviction moratoriums and things like that. And I think that, what the majority said in this opinion that we won just a couple of days ago is, hey, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. This applies to other presidential initiatives, and including, of course, this one here, and that it would be a violation of the Major Questions Doctrine for Congress to have not even used the word tariff or duty or anything like that in IEPA, and then to have a president come along and say, ha, I can now do whatever I want.
So let's expand this a bit. How creative was it of the administration to try and get tariffs imposed under IEPA? Is this something that's just wildly outside of what IEPA originally was designed about?
100%. Nobody, and I've read the legislative history behind IEPA very carefully, nobody thought that this was about the tariff power. And so, yes, they get A++ for creativity, the Trump administration, in coming up with an argument that not only no one in Congress thought, no president for 50 years has thought. Now, creativity only gets you so far because you have to be at least somewhat faithful and accurate to the original text and meaning of the law. And that's where I think, unfortunately, they get an F and they fall down on the job.
So I have a pretty solid recollection of sitting in constitutional law classes and occasionally seeing a decision that was just perplexing. Although when you're looking at something that's a century old, a Dred Scott or a separate but equal type of decision, obviously you're bringing a modern perspective. It's very hard to see outside of that. I had the same, you and I spoke before we had the decision come down. I was kind of perplexed that this was even like a debate. It seems pretty obvious. None of the normal rules for enacting tariffs, none of the procedures, policies, or allocation of powers amongst branches of government was followed. So what do you imagine the government's argument is going to be at the Supreme Court level?
Right. So, Barry, I think the secret about Supreme Court and presidential power advocacy is this. I mean, no matter how creative and ridiculous the argument is, if the president voices it, it's a court case and it's going to be taken seriously by everyone because it's, after all, the president. Sure. And that's why, when I was the president's top lawyer, courtroom lawyer, I was very careful to only make the arguments that I thought had very strong basis behind them, because you don't want to diminish that credibility that the government has with the US Supreme Court. Here, I do think that the arguments are quite a stretch for the administration to be making. And I think, that's what you saw reflected in the 7-4 opinion. So what do I think that the Solicitor General is going to say to the Supreme Court? I think he's going to say what he's been saying all along. The president says he needs this power. It'd be dangerous to unwind all of these deals and present it as a fait accompli. And I just think that's the wrong way to think about constitutional law, to allow a president to do what he wants in the interim and then say, oh, it'd be too dangerous to unwind it. I think it's better to get the constitutional rules right the first time.
So some of the arguments I've seen from the administration is not only are the tariffs complicated and we've spent all this time and effort negotiating them, which this would negate, but it would be a negative for the global economy. You will cause economic distress around the world if you throw these tariffs out. Seems like a little bit of a histrionic claim.
Well, I have two things to say about that, and we can defer to the president about whether the claim is right or wrong, whether it's histrionic or the like. Let's just say it's right. Two things. One, if that's right, it walks right into the constitutional problem, which is the major questions doctrine, right? If the administration is saying, oh, the economy is going to collapse without these things, that's exactly the kind of major question that you think Congress has to decide, not the president, number one. And number two, if it isn't histrionic, if it's really right that the economy is going to collapse, then it's the easiest thing in the world for the president to go to Congress and seek authorization. I mean, I don't think the Congress wants the US economy to collapse. And there are, of course, members of his own political party that are running Congress. So there's not even a politics barrier or anything like that.
Thank you, Neil, for being so generous with your time. We have been speaking with Neil Katyal. He is the appellate litigator for VOS Selections versus Trump, which seeks to declare the president's tariffs not only null and void, but unconstitutional. If you enjoy this conversation, well, check out any of the other 500 we've done over the past 12 years. You can find those at iTunes, Spotify, Bloomberg.